our distinguished guest, Willow Lung-Amam. But before we get to that introduction, I'll note that this event is being recorded and will be made available to the wider public. I hope that won't be an impediment to participation during the Q&A. I also want to thank Alexis Boyce in the Asian American Studies program for organizing this lecture, for all the logistics and the nuts and bolts and the tech. All of that work is down to her. And I want to thank the Department of City and Regional Planning, the Brooks School of Public Policy, the Department of Sociology, the Cornell Population Center, and the university's really quite fabulous migrations initiative for co-sponsoring this event. I also want to acknowledge that although this talk is happening remotely and via Zoom, and many of us are in vastly different places, I am coming to you from, and Cornell University is located on, the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, or the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with an historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, of New York State, and indeed of the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and these waters. For those of you who are joining us from other locales in the US and Canada especially, I want to encourage you to check out Native Land Digital, and I'll put the URL in the chat so everybody has an opportunity to check out this amazing website to see who lived on the land where you currently sit, and to begin the process not only of acknowledging that presence, but also of learning about, honoring, and I hope working toward justice in regard to Native and Indigenous peoples past and present. It was actually Jawan's idea to invite, Professor Lung-Amam to speak with us today as part of a class that we in the program are incredibly happy he's teaching this semester. It's on Asian American labor and migration. Jawan's enthusiasm for bringing to his class and to campus the ideas and research of some of the most exciting, the most important scholars working in the field has been really an inspiration. And Jawan, as a scholar in his own right, is right in line with the best of the social scientists and Asian Americanists. He works on U.S. immigration policy and its effect on the family formation of queer immigrants, and on the role of ethnic businesses in employing, for good or for ill, low-wage immigrant workers. So it's only fitting that he has the honor of introducing our guest. So I'll turn it over to him. Jawan.
Great. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Professor Chang. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Willow Lung-Amam, who is visiting us virtually from the University of Maryland, College Park. Earlier today, she was generous enough to visit the class I'm teaching with the Asian American Studies program this semester, and I'm excited to hear more about her work and her book. So Willow Lung-Amam, Ph.D., is Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she also serves as Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth, Research and Education, and Director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network. She has written extensively on suburban poverty, racial segregation, immigration, gentrification, redevelopment politics, and neighborhood opportunity. She's the author of Trespassers, Asian American and the Battle for Suburbia, and a forthcoming book on redevelopment politics and equitable development organizing in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Audience members, please send in your questions to Dr. Lung-Amam using the Q&A function throughout the talk, and we'll get to them once she's over with her talk. So Dr. Lung-Amam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Juan, Dr. Chang, and the Asian American Studies program for having me. This program also has a very impressive list of co-sponsors. So to all the co-sponsors, thank you so much. I did have a wonderful visit with Juwan's class this morning, and I can see the level of enthusiasm, care, concern, and just deep intellect amongst the students at Cornell for topics related to Asian American studies. So it's such an honor to be here. Today I've been asked to give a short synopsis of my book, Trespassers, Asian American, and the Battle for Suburbia, and I'm happy to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and then hopefully we will have time at the end for robust discussions and questions about the book. All right, so the focus of this book is really on the processes and politics of Asian American placemaking in the suburbs of Silicon Valley. This comes out of a long and deep process that I engaged in as part of my dissertation work at the University of California at Berkeley, which seems so long ago now that I've been at the University of Maryland for 8 years. But it really came out of my interest in seeing some of the patterns that were happening in suburbs. These charts from 2010 show by racial and ethnic group who lives in suburbs today in the US. And what it shows you is that all racial and ethnic minority groups and immigrants now live in suburbs. And this might not be surprising to some, but it was relatively surprising to me as a young urban scholar who was taught that racialized poverty and racialized neighborhoods generally happened in the cities. And that is defied by many of the statistics of who now lives in suburbs. Asian Americans have been leading this trend among non-white groups for a long time, with 62% residing in suburbs and the majority of immigrants residing in suburbs as well. But we also know it's not just the suburbs of any city. There are places that have more Asian migration than others. And one of the things that I found in my own research and which rang true as part of the reasons for writing this book is because we've seen in the past several decades so much of that associated with places that are associated with the growth of high tech, right, like Silicon Valley. So the map on the left shows you areas where there are high numbers of immigrant high-tech entrepreneurs. And the map on the right shows you Indian foreign-born as a percentage of the population and Chinese foreign-born as a percentage of the population. And these maps, somewhat not surprisingly, don't look all that different. You see population where immigrant entrepreneurship is happening is often in places where you see a high level of Asian immigrants. And this is in part because many of these high-tech companies have lobbied for new immigration laws and have been part of what has been drawing immigration and shaping immigration policy in the United States for the past several decades. This is where Silicon Valley is. It is one of the, has one of the highest Asian American populations in the United States and in California, one of the largest states for Asian American migration. The book project looks at how Asian Americans really made home and built community in the Silicon Valley. So it's not a typical Silicon Valley story of high-tech entrepreneurs or even doesn't even really touch on the workplace at all. It's really concerned with how Asian Americans are occupying their homes and their landscapes of everyday life and building community and shaping and repurposing the given landscape, right? How these quote unquote other suburbanites are making place and shaping the social and political conflicts in their given jurisdictions. And part of the reason why I call them other suburbanites and why I'm interested in these questions is because for so long, the narrative about suburbs has been driven by the post-war sort of homogeneous ideas, the white middle class. But Asian Americans are making home and place in very unique ways. And these ways in which they're making place are often stirring and being challenged by established white populations. So I'm looking at the social and political conflicts that have been fought over the changes that Asian Americans have inspired and how these conflicts have affected the ways that Asian Americans have been integrated into their communities and the benefits that they have received from that suburbia once seemed to promise to its residents, right? And so how is opportunity for Asian Americans and mobility being shaped by some of these conflicts? And so I'm arguing in part that some of these landscapes that I'm going to be talking about today, schools, Asian malls, and the so-called McMansions, are places that really reflect a very different version and vision of the suburban American dream that might have than what might have been for many middle-class post-war white suburbanites. That Asian Americans have adapted the landscape to their own needs, desires, and uses, and mixed some of the comforts of their traditional suburban American life with the social and communal traditions of life in Asia, right? And that's reflected in these the three kind of landscapes that I'm going to be talking about today. But I'm also arguing that these actions have been perceived by some or contested by some established and often white residents, city planners, and policymakers as a form of trespassing. Trespassing defined here as to make unwanted or uninvited incursions into the landscape. And so I'm investigating how these conflicts around these landscapes have been treated as such. And so I argue in the book that the landscapes that Asian Americans have fostered and founded in the Silicon Valley have been part of landscapes of difference, right? These are kind of embattled landscapes and the focus of many city and policy and planning efforts that have aimed at muting or managing the differences as expressed by Asian Americans in the landscape. And that this is a form of suburban inequality. It's not just about exclusion, right? As we're used to kind of talking about suburbs as places that exclude non-white or low-income folks, but as more subtle expressions of white privilege and power. The dominant norms and standards that shape a given landscape and that govern or limit the expressions of difference within them, and thereby uphold spatial homogeneity, conformity, order, stability, are critical tenets of the ways in which suburban regulations work. And they also work in that way to uphold middle-class whites as the kind of standard bearers for what suburbia is supposed to look like and be like for non-white. So I use this idea of the racialization of space throughout the book to talk about the experiences of Asian Americans in the suburbs of Silicon Valley. A quote by Richard Schein is that all American landscapes are racialized and can and should be seen through the lens of race. And for white Americans, we tend to think about their landscapes as valued and valuable and fruits of their hard labor. But for non-whites, they tend to the neighborhoods that they occupy or the spaces that they occupy tend to reinforce their kind of incapacity or unwillingness to do what it takes to make it in America. And so that's what I mean by a kind of racialized landscape, is the way that race and place work together to reinforce ideas about different groups. And I think nowhere is this more true than in suburbia, which was constructed constructed on ideas about whiteness and reinforced white Americans' social and economic privilege and power. The ways in which post-war landscapes were idealized amongst the white middle class, the nuclear family, these kind of picturesque and pastoral landscapes of suburbia that was shaping the idea of the American dream, but were systematically denied to non-whites through redlining, through racial restricted covenants and other acts of violence and ongoing forms of exclusion. So here on the left, I have a picture of Levittown, one of the most well-known post-war suburbs. But at the same time, these kind of landscapes really work to obscure the work that goes into maintaining these privileged spaces. And when you think about the ways in which Asian Americans have been racialized into the landscape, you think perhaps about the 19th and early 20th century Chinatowns, the kind of pictures that you see on the right-hand side, where you see these kind of seedy, dark havens of criminal activity, and Asian Americans as the source of blight and contagion. But what you don't see is the kind of racialized zoning and disinvestment that went into the makings of Chinatown. And today, when you think of those same landscapes, you think about these exotified images that also seem to symbolize the presumed inability of Asian Americans to assimilate into the American mainstream. So in the same way, the landscapes continue to shape our ideas about race and the racialized other. I came to Fremont, not truly intending to study Fremont. Fremont is where I locate the story that I tell in this book. But I came to it first through what I might call shoeleather research. This is someone who is interested in studying inequality and neighborhoods and built environments. I was looking at how this was playing out across the Bay Area. I explained to Juwan's class earlier today how I came to do a lot of this research through my own maps and through my own explorations of the Bay Area. And when I came to Fremont, the Little Cobble Market is one of the first places that I saw. If you look at the sign, it sells Indo and Pakistani, Fijian and Afghani groceries. It represents the coming together of so many different groups and cultures all in one place. And it's just one of many stores on a common suburban strip mall. And it defied a lot of what I thought about suburbs, a lot of who I thought lived in suburbs, and a lot of what I thought about a suburban mall. And so when going into these places and beginning to talk to people like the owner of the Little Cobble Market, I began to ask them about their stories, how they came to this suburb called Fremont, and what some of the reasons for that were, what some of the meanings and ideas behind their own migration stories were, but also some of the social conflicts and tensions that they were seeing. And so these observations of landscapes and just hanging out in malls such as the Little Cobble, the one that Little Cobble Market sits in, became the backbone of my research. I ended up doing 130 interviews across these 3 different landscapes with students, parents, principals, teachers, board members, city council members, even the mayor of Fremont, and really trying to document the life of Asian American communities in Fremont, as well as some of the tensions over these landscapes. I also looked at archives, census records, historical documents, and records from city board and planning meetings to do this work. So what am I talking about when I say Silicon Valley? Well, this map gives you a sense of what that looks like in 1980 versus 2000, looking at Asian American populations in what we might call the core Silicon Valley cities. Now, if I were giving this map to, showing this map in California, many people would object to what I've chosen to call core Silicon Valley cities, but this is a sprawling suburban area with many different cities that make up the Silicon Valley. And what the map on the left shows you is that Asian Americans in 1980 made up a very small percentage of the population in any one of these cities. But that by 2010, there were at least 4 majority Asian American cities in the Silicon Valley. So immigration has happened relatively rapidly, and it's very much changing the demographics of the Silicon Valley, and it is very much changing the landscape of the Silicon Valley. This is Fremont, the place that we'll be talking about for the rest of today. When you see Fremont demographics, you see just how rapidly that change has happened in one city. This is Fremont in 1960 versus 2010. And you see in 1960, the kinds of exclusive forms of development and all the race restrictive covenants and other things that we've already talked about really did make Fremont into a majority white suburb for most of the 1960s and 70s up and through to the 80s. But by that time, you begin to see the effect of new immigration laws that are beginning to prioritize non-white immigrants, family reunification, and especially the draw of the Silicon Valley and these employer-related visas that are beginning to attract much more Asian immigrants. And so between 1990, especially after 1990, you begin to see the population of whites diminish dramatically and Asian Americans become the majority in Fremont. And unlike what we tend to think about when we talk about majority non-white suburbs, this has happened alongside a dramatic increase in the overall median household income. These tend to be educated, professional, skilled immigrants that are coming to places like Fremont. And so you see the foreign-born population shooting up during the period, but also the median income shooting up during the period. So I'm going to talk briefly about schools and Asian malls that form central parts of the book, but I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about the so-called McMansion at the end of this talk. So schools, why did I decide to talk about schools? Well, one of the reasons why I decided to talk about schools is because everybody else in Fremont was talking about schools. And when I asked an Asian American family, why was it that you chose to settle in Fremont? The majority of families would say because of the schools. And so schools were a major driver of Asian American families to locating within the Silicon Valley to Fremont, because Fremont has some of the best public schools in the state of California. But it was also a draw for many families to locate even from overseas. So I heard consistently stories about families who had made the decision that their daughter or son was going to go to high school in Fremont from Taiwan or mainland China. So the driver of education was so important to the families in which I talked about and to. And so here I'm showing you a map of the population of Fremont by block group and showing you where Asian Americans have tended to cluster. And then I'm also showing you where those highest quality schools, those that rank highly on what California calls their API index, academic performance index, a standard rating for the quality of schools. And so California, Fremont has a number of 10 out of 10s, and those are all the black flags. And then you see that where Asian Americans are clustered are near those black flags because they are locating into neighborhoods where their kids can get the best education that they can. And I spent a lot of time inside that blue boundary, which is the Mission High attendance boundary. Mission High being one of the most competitive and high-ranking public schools in the state of California, which also has the highest percentage of Asian American residents in Fremont as a neighborhood. And there I documented the kind of changes that Asian Americans had brought to the school. This is a school that was historically kind of a mediocre academically performing school, but as the migration of Asian American families increased, then the school got increasingly high ranking in that area. And so did, you know, the changes to the curriculum. It really moved from a more sort of liberal arts, sports related school where theater and things were, you know, popular, to a very science and math driven programming, a lot of AP courses that were offered, and a very kind of high stress environment for high school students. And so I talk about how Asian Americans and their ideals for education really reshape the culture and the curriculum of the school. This cartoon comes out of the Smoke Signal, which is the school newspaper at Mission High, and is just talking about the stress that students feel over grades. But I talk about this pressure to succeed within the context of sort of thinking about why families are migrating to the area, and also thinking about the selective migration of Asian American families, those families who are locating into the Valley being the most likely to be educated and see the fruits of their own success through education as driving some of those patterns. And so I talk about that, but I also talk about kind of the new white flight. So the former is in part sort of trying to dispel many of the model minority myths that might come with a school like Fremont, and showing the ways in which some families, feel the pressure of that model minority myth, and even trying to explain some of the reasons why families who might fit that model a little bit more, why that might be at, in a school like Mission High. But what I spend the majority of my time talking about is how the established white population has responded to these cultural shifts and these curriculum shifts in the school. And this quote is taken by a Mission High teacher who says, who's talking to other white families about why they have decided to leave Mission San Jose High. I showed you the numbers across Fremont of how white families have declined in number. If I showed you the numbers across Mission San Jose High, you would be shocked because only within like a 2-decade period did it switch from majority white to majority Asian, and is now something like 85% Asian American population. And so whites were not just, attritioning out of the school, they were also deciding to leave the school and the neighborhood. And so here, this teacher is talking about why did that happen, at least amongst the parents that she's talked to. And it says, you don't honor the needs of white students. You've shut down all the elective, the wood shops are shut down, only white kids signed up for it. There's no electives available to white students that are appropriate for them. All you're doing is upping the advanced placement this, the advanced placement that. There's no longer a traditional, quote unquote, regular, quote unquote, high school that is amenable to a regular kid. And so it's the sense that Asian Americans were making the school foreign or making it something not normal through their own experience of education, their own desires to use education as a form of upward mobility. And so I talk about how this led to new geographies of race where white families were deciding to leave the neighborhood and go sometimes just to the next neighborhood over to enroll their kids in less competitive schools that might have had more theater and more sports, where their kids could actually succeed better and that more match their sense of value of what a liberal arts education should be, but also put their kids in a better position to be able to get into elite colleges as well. Then the Asian Mall. So the Asian Mall, I call it this because this is what those people who I talk to tend to call it. These are traditional shopping centers, some of which are built to accommodate largely Asian American stores or stores that serve largely Asian American customers, or sometimes traditional, I don't know, let's say traditional, but established strip centers, suburban strip centers that are changing over in terms of uses in stores to stores that largely serve Asian American customers. And I talk about these places as a center for Asian American community and cultural hubs for Asian Americans in the suburbs in ways that really defy our stereotypical notions about suburban shopping centers and in ways that really talk about the vibrant life that happens within them. This is just one of the pictures that I took at my local Asian American shopping center, where you have in the hallways people gathering to listen to music outside of the music store, not within it. And so I talk about all the ways in which these shopping centers are both special and mundane to many Asian American families, how they embed a sense of comfort and acceptance for many who have migrated to a new home, all the ways in which these are meeting grounds for many different and diverse groups, and the ways in which they embed that translocal and transnational connection. But I also talk about the kind of backlash against these mall spaces, the ways that established residents, largely white, often talk about Asian retail as sort of taking over the retail landscape. They often talk about them as being too many or too much, or why does everything have to be a new development need to be an Asian mall? They talk about the ways in which they promote segregation and are unwelcoming to non-Asian residents. And they don't feel comfortable to go to the Asian mall, and that everybody there, except for them, is Asian. And I talk about the ways in which city officials and planners have also talked about these malls in similar kinds of terms. They talk about Asian language signage as being problematic, that there's this kind of unhealthy clustering of businesses. I was talking in Juwan's class about how many restaurants can you fit into an Asian mall. The kind of aesthetics of these malls, that there are oftentimes too many posters or too many things on windows, the kind of idea that they're kind of trashy or chaotic, like a Chinatown street. And so the ways in which planners and city officials have really tried to adopt regulations that really limit some of these things that make the Asian mall particular and special. And I do that through thinking about a particular kind of new regulation that Fremont adopted around the size of retail condos. Retail condos is a unique form to Asian malls, where instead of renting your space in a typical mall, you actually own your commercial condo unit, which I think, being director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Project now, I think we would think about as a really innovative form of commercial ownership, and something that can really help to spur control and wealth building for new immigrant communities. And many Asian Americans talked about it in that form. But for city officials and planners who are responding in part to some of what established residents are saying, they're oftentimes using these regulations to control the size of units, visibility into the units, the aesthetics of the units, the signage, and making way for the potential redevelopment of these units. And so in many ways, they're regulating all the features that make the Asian mall unique and in fact special to Asian American communities. But there is one kind of mall that has been relatively embraced in Fremont, and those are the kind of malls that I would say more fit into our perhaps more exotified image, or more perhaps inclusive image of an ethnic shopping center. And so here I'm presenting an image of the Globe Mall. This is a mall that was proposed actually by an Asian American developer in Fremont. It was never built because of the financial crisis, not wholesalely built anyway because of the financial crisis. But when he came to Fremont, he was building Asian malls in San Jose and other places in the Silicon Valley. And he came to Fremont and had the sense that the city council and planners in the city were not really big fans of Asian mall development because of some of the things that we had talked about before. And so when he came to Fremont, he said, I'm not going to build an Asian mall. I'm going to build a mall that is welcoming to people from all across the globe, right? And so that's why he called it the Globe Mall. And so in his mall plan, he had a space literally for everybody. A little Africa, a little Europea. There was even a section for Australia in his mall, which of course Fremont didn't have very many Australians and even very few Europeans living in Fremont at the time, and certainly very few Africans. But he was really playing into this idea of trying to defy the stereotypes of Asian American malls as exclusive kinds of spaces. And this mall received a lot of excitement from the city council. One of the city council members said that this is like our own little Epcot Center in Fremont. So they were very excited, and even though it used the same form of the retail condos as in other Asian malls, they passed this through the planning department relatively quickly, and certainly without some of the questions and problems that had come up around other Asian malls. As I said, it wasn't built in part because of the financial crisis, and the developer filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And after coming out of bankruptcy, he came back and said, you know what, I can't build the whole mall because it's just not financially feasible. But what I can build is one part of the mall that actually has a market here in Fremont, and that I actually have the finance to be able to build. And of course, that was the Asian Mall. And so it just speaks to the ways in which there are some accessible and ways in which, you know, diversity that sort of has a marketability that, you know, ethnic retail like Asian malls does not for many cities like Fremont. And then finally, I want to talk about these so-called McMansions, or what some even more derisively call the Monster House. This is a neighborhood right next to Mission San Jose High, which I showed you before in talking about the schools. And this is a neighborhood where many Asian immigrants whose families want to locate to Mission San Jose in order to send their children to the high school will buy homes. Historically, the Mission Ranch neighborhood had homes that were relatively modest, but on relatively large lots, similar to the kind of smaller homes that you might see here on the right-hand side. As Asian Americans have become the majority in this neighborhood, some, not all, and not even very many, have chosen to tear down these smaller homes and build larger homes in their place. And this has raised controversies throughout the Mission Ranch neighborhood, and in fact, throughout the city, over the form, the size, and the regulation of these homes. This is Daniel standing with his wife in front of their the home that they initially bought in Mission Ranch in the 1980s when they located into the Mission Ranch neighborhood. And I sat with Daniel for a long time talking about why he had located into the Mission Ranch neighborhood. He talked about how when he first located there, him and his wife were struggling. They were new immigrants. They just needed a house where they could send their daughters to school. So they were not looking for the best house. They were looking to the area where they could afford a house and where they could send their kids to the best schools, because that's what mattered most to them in a neighborhood. The house on the right is also Daniel's house. Daniel knocked down this house that he bought, which is a post-war ranch style house, and built his dream house on the same lot. And in the chapter, I talk about the ways in which controversies over the rebuilding of homes in this neighborhood really was a culture clash, in a sense, between Daniel and his neighbors. The kind of ways in which the established, largely white residents of the neighborhood talked about what it means to respect and retain the existing character of a neighborhood as being really important to Daniel, that didn't really matter. What mattered to him in a neighborhood was primarily the value of education and the opportunities that the neighborhood provided for his family. The established residents talked about the value of these small single family homes and the neighborhoods that they remembered growing up in, where 4th of July parties were held in the streets and where the majority of people spent their time outside riding bikes in the street. For Daniel, none of that mattered. He talked about how this larger home that he was able to rebuild in his house had all the features that he wanted. The larger house, in fact, allowed Daniel to be able to really build out his dream house, where the top floor has a master bedroom for Daniel and his wife, and the bottom floor also has a master bedroom for Daniel's children to be able to come and later live in the house and take care of Daniel, and to send their children to Mission San Jose High. So for Daniel, the idea of the single family house for only one household was an anomaly to what he thought about as his dream house. He wanted a multi-generational house, and he needed a bigger house in order to do that. The established neighborhoods residents talked about the preserving these historic homes and the unique character and elements of the neighborhood. And Daniel talked about how his house was really, that he wasn't really concerned with having a historic house. In fact, he and his wife hated the house from the minute they moved in, and the carpet was old and dingy, and they didn't, they could never, none of their daughters ever had their own room. It was always too small and they hated it. And what they really wanted was a new home. And so they didn't really see the value of a historic home for them, or these unique neighborhood elements that other residents were talking about. The established residents talked about, gave aesthetic critiques of Daniel's homes and said, it's not beautiful, right? It doesn't fit the character of the neighborhood. And Daniel said, this is the most beautiful home that I could think of, right? They talked about the value of the great outdoors and having, being able to look out these large picture windows. This is established residents. Whereas Daniel said, there's a lot of environmental features that I've built into my home with multiple layers of insulation and low flush toilets. And so why is my house less environmentally friendly than yours? And so these kind of debates really inflamed the kind of tensions that happened in the Mission Ranch neighborhood over the rebuilding of these homes that primarily pitted established white residents against new Asian immigrant residents. Here I'm showing you a home of Daniel's neighbor, who was one of these established white residents who had lived in the neighborhood for a long time and who had kept their ranch style house exactly as it was from the post-war period, and who grew up in the kind of neighborhoods, in a similar kind of neighborhood in California. So and when I asked them, why did they move to this neighborhood? They said just that, because this is the kind of neighborhood that we grew up in. We remember the 4th of July barbecues. We remember the strong sense of community that came alongside these neighborhoods, and we treasure, that sense of neighborhood, that sense of community that these new McMansions are destroying in our neighborhood. And when we did the interview, they took me out to their backyard, and we spent the whole time out in their backyard talking about all the ways in which, if a McMansion was built next door, it would really destroy their sense of privacy and their sense of what this neighborhood represented to them. And so these, but what I want to say about that nostalgic vision of, the post-war suburb is that it was really built out through tools of exclusion. So Mission Ranch and Glenmore Gardens were two neighborhoods that had racial covenants in place that were built with FHA loans in the post-war period that excluded non-whites and racially diverse neighborhoods from being built in suburbs, and that also adopted HOAs and other documents, other design documents that prevented, that maintained a sort of quality of the house. And so these were very exclusive neighborhoods until Asian Americans began to move in. These were also the neighborhoods that protested the loudest and the longest when Asian Americans began rebuilding in the neighborhoods. And these were also the two neighborhoods that got the city council and planners to adopt new regulations for their neighborhoods, design regulations that told residents of those neighborhoods, if they were rebuilding their homes, as they were allowed to do under existing zoning regulations, what kind of designs the city was trying to encourage and what kinds of homes the city was trying to avoid. And if you see the avoid, which actually comes out of their design guidelines and which are used to approve design permits for these neighborhoods, the one on the left looks a lot like Daniel's house. And the encouraged looks a lot like the second house that I showed you, where established residents lived in the neighborhood. And so if you were trying to rebuild in this neighborhood and you brought your design permits and your sketches to the planning office, the planners might say, well, we think that you might want to take away that oval window and instead do a barn style window, or take away those stucco tiles on your roof and instead do wood shingles. And so really prioritizing the kind of aesthetic values that established residents said that they wanted and prized in their neighborhood. And then they also adopted two new development standards for these two neighborhoods. And so the development standards on the left-hand side over here show you what could be built in the Mission Ranch neighborhood prior to the adoption of new regulations in 2010, as this controversy was blowing up in the neighborhood. So in 2006, you could basically build a box on your lot with required setbacks on the front and the back and the sides. But your top and your bottom floor could essentially look the same in the Mission Ranch neighborhood if you were rebuilding a house or building a house for the first time. After this controversy, the planning department said, no, you can't do that anymore. If you're rebuilding a house in the Mission Ranch neighborhood, you're only allowed, we're restricting your maximum floor to area ratio or the amount of developable space that you're allowed to build on your house to basically, if you're going to do a 2-story house, about half of what you used to be able to build. If you're going to do a 1-story house, you can build a little bit bigger, but not much. So what this is doing is basically cutting in half the allowable square footage of the build out. And importantly, what they said, if you're going to build a 2-story house, is that you have to put that you can only have a small addition on the top, what Daniel called a submarine house. That basically made Daniel's house and his dream of a house impossible, because it didn't allow for him to have the upper floor be a kind of separate suite for himself and his wife, and a bottom floor to have a master suite for his daughter, and to be able to move back in and have a multi-generational household. And so what it's essentially doing is taking many of the values that established residents talked about was important to them and embedding them in new planning and design regulations for these homes. And so I asked planners and policymakers, why do we do this? And they talked, and this is Mayor Bob Wasserman, who was mayor at the time and has since passed away, talking about why he got involved in this debate and why the city council felt so compelled to become involved in this debate. And he said, quote unquote, people were coming in and just building these horrible looking things that virtually ruined the neighborhood. I was very sympathetic. I'm usually pretty liberal on what I'd allowed to be built, but that was terrible what they were doing architecturally and even culturally, right? And so there was the sense that these homes were so foreign and so out of place and so different than what had been the norm. And I think it embeds a larger sense that the residents themselves sort of reflected the kind of difference or othering that these houses represented to many residents. As I come to a close, I want to just say that Suburbia has to be able to change. It has to be able to, as I say in the book, chart new storylines. That is that the demographics of our suburbs are changing, and so should the built environment that reflects the sense of place, belonging, and identities of its residents. In 1947, Levittown, New York was known for being one of the most exclusive suburbs built with racial covenants and through FHA loans that had redlining embedded in it, and were not giving loans to non-white families. And so not only was the sort of neighborhood occupants very similar in terms of their racial composition, but the homes were very similar. But over time, if you watch the footprint of those homes between 1947 and 2011, everybody in Levittown added on to their homes. They added on to their homes because they weren't, in fact, all the same. All those original residents of Levittown, they had very different lifestyles. They had different desires for their homes. They had different, some became single mothers. Some, had multi-generational families. Some LGBTQ couples lived in these homes. Some had multiple children. Some had no children at all. And so what has happened in Levittown is the neighborhood and the homes have come to reflect that diversity. And what I'm arguing is that our planning and design regulations that shape the built environment of our suburbs have to reflect the diversity of the residents who live there. And so I close with some thoughts about moving towards more inclusive suburban landscapes, thinking about the kinds of processes of landscape change that we've talked about that have been fraught by conflict, in sometimes very overt, but sometimes very subtle ways, and how racial privilege and power are often invested in the built form of landscapes and become an outlet for communities' unresolved tensions and fears over immigration. And so I call in the book, and the title of my next book actually may be The Right to Suburbia, which is the right of others to craft suburban landscapes that reflect their dreams, that reflect their non-normative identities, needs, and desires, that challenge our ideas about what good suburban form look like, that embrace a sense of messiness and conflict in the landscape, and that ultimately we're designing for change and opening up planning processes and decision-making processes and trying to disrupt these subtle forms of exclusion that protect, that really reflect a kind of set of precious rights that I believe are fast receding alongside suburbanization. So essentially to protect and promote what I call landscapes of difference. As I think about this, I think about my new neighborhood in Washington, D.C. This is just literally right around the corner from where I'm standing right now, a home in my neighborhood in Washington, D.C. that is inside D.C. So technically it's urban, but it's actually relatively suburban in terms of the houses in the neighborhood. And when I first moved into this neighborhood, I took a walk, and most of the homes are unique homes, but they basically fit the same patterns and styles of homes. But I ran into this home here, which has a Jamaican flag you can see in it, but what you can't see very well is the yard itself, which has a concrete map of Jamaica built into the yard. And when I first saw this, I was like, why would anybody do this? Tear up their whole yard in order to sort of build a map of Jamaica. And if you know Jamaica, you know its rolling landscape of hills and Ocho Rios and Negril and so forth. And all of that is marked on his front yard. But as I sat and wrote this book and thought about what it means to be able to express your identity, your needs, and your desires in the landscape, I now look at this as a model of the kinds of things that we should be promoting in our landscapes in terms of allowing these cultural expressions of difference in our landscapes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lung-Amam. That was such a fascinating talk, and love hearing about your work, and such a good extension of the discussion we had in our class today. So to attendees, I already have a few questions lined up, but if you do have more, please do share using the Q&A feature. So I'm going to start with a question from Angelica from my class. So Angelica asks, on the topic of the conflict between established white residents' perception of what's important in a neighborhood and Asian immigrant residents, can you speak about the relationship between Asian immigrants and the homeowners association and the norms that the HOAs enforce?
Yeah, so I think most of us don't really understand that many of the housing forms that we see don't just come about through people's preferences, but are actually highly regulated. And HOAs or homeowners associations is one of those ways, more typically in suburbs, in which that design is regulated. So HOAs can regulate anything from, the plants that you can put in your front yard, to the house colors that you put on your shutters, to whether or not you're able to build extensions onto your house. And so in both of Glenmore Gardens and Mission Ranch, they had HOAs in place initially when the neighborhoods were built. Glenmore Gardens was able to maintain their HOA, and their HOA fought very hard to restrict the McMansion type of development and use their regulations to do so. Mission Ranch, and I would say one of the reasons why this issue really came to the fore in Mission Ranch was because their HOA standards were no longer really being upheld. There was no active homeowners association that was enforcing those rules and regulations. And so they had really lapsed. And so people were kind of building what they were allowed to build according to the zoning standards, which I showed you was that box, which kind of looks a lot like Daniel's house that was built. And so what the residents of that neighborhood did is they essentially asked the city to come up with another set of covenants for their neighborhood, and to make sure that their priorities were now part of city regulation. And so now the planners essentially do the job of an HOA in terms of regulating the size, the color, those design regulations that I say that I talk about, those can regulate anything from the color to the materials of homes that are being used. And so it acts a lot like an HOA. And so those city regulations that are now in place are really used to think for planners to really regulate what can happen in the homes. And they really prioritize those values that are held by established white residents, and don't really make room for Asian Americans who want another type of home for good and valuable reasons, to actually do what they want in their homes.
Great, thank you. There's a question about the generally about more theoretically when we think about suburbs and home ownership. So when we're thinking about McMansions, Professor Chang asks, to what extent are the ideas around design informed by notions of private property ownership and autonomy?
Yeah, so I think there's a much larger discussion about home ownership and exclusion in suburbs, of which Asian Americans are a part, right? We're now having debates around single family home neighborhoods in planning, and many cities are adopting regulations against single family only zoned neighborhoods like Mission Ranch, which is a much broader conversation about exclusion and inclusion in suburbs. Because even as Asian Americans are fighting for, the right to be able to build homes that sort of match their sensibility around aesthetics or their desire for multi-generational houses, these are still relatively exclusive neighborhoods, high income neighborhoods. There's only a few apartment complexes in the Mission San Jose neighborhood that have been vigorously fought by established white residents and Asian Americans alike. These are still very exclusive neighborhoods. And so I am not arguing in this book that Asian Americans are not part of the exclusive trajectory of middle and upper middle income neighborhoods like Mission Ranch and like Fremont more broadly. But what I am arguing is that we also need to pay attention to the inequalities amongst Asian Americans and white Americans and the ways in which those inequalities are embedded through public policy.
Thank you for that clarification. And I did also want to ask a somewhat related question, which is, and I don't know if this was necessarily the point of your work, but I wonder if you got some of this data. What do you think is the disposition among the wealthier Asian Americans you talk to towards residential equity? And do you think in I guess an extension of that, do the middle class and upper middle class Asian Americans, do they also perpetuate exclusion of lower income families?
Yes, I think we are all embedded in cycles of inequality and structures of inequality in some way. And so again, I'm not saying that these Asian Americans are excluded in the same way as African Americans from these neighborhoods. And there's really very few African Americans that even live in Fremont because they can't afford Fremont and homes in Fremont, but also because African Americans' experience of integration in suburbs has been very different than Asian Americans. Charlotte Brooks wrote a book called, now I'm gonna forget it, right? Because it was right on the tip of my tongue, but Foreign Neighbors, something friends or something, basically talking about how at one point Asian Americans went from being, thought of as sort of the worst of the worst in terms of neighbors and were really fought against in terms of integration for their foreignness to being more welcomed as suburban neighbors amongst white Americans and sort of thought about as sort of, a more palatable neighbors than African Americans. And so they've had an easier time integrating into white neighborhoods, not only because of their professional status and the selective migration of professional skilled immigrants, educated immigrants, but also because of perceptions about racial acceptability. And so, that definitely plays into the positionality and the ways in which Asian Americans have been able to, thank you, alien neighbors, foreign friends, the ways in which Asian Americans have been able to integrate into some neighborhoods where African Americans could not go, but also the ways in which higher income Asian Americans, predominantly Indians, Taiwanese, and Chinese, differ from their lower income counterparts, Filipinos, South Asians, who tend to work and live in more working class neighborhoods, particularly in San Jose and other parts of the valley. And so these are not all inclusive neighborhoods. They are really neighborhoods that are built through the tools of both class and racial exclusion that have hierarchies embedded in them. And Asian Americans are part of those hierarchies through the ways in which they perpetuate exclusion of not only at homes, that like apartments and zoning that might allow for different class integration in Fremont, but also through upholding things like, these super highly competitive schools that make them very exclusive and that don't make a lot of room for integration across race and class.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could just quickly provide a little bit more contextualization for those who are not super familiar with California and the Bay Area. So You talk about Fremont, and you're talking about particular class and racialized groups. So I was wondering if you notice ethnic stratification across neighborhoods, and how Fremont is placed within the broader Bay Area.
Yeah, in the beginning chapter of my book, I talk about sort of ethnic and class stratification amongst Asian American communities in the Bay Area in order to situate Fremont as a particular kind of suburb, right? So it's not the working class suburb of San Jose where African Americans and working class Asian Americans live side by side. It's not the kind of suburb that even just, as I was telling you in your class, that even Fremont sort of surrounds this more working class neighborhood called Newark, where there's more Latinx communities, where there's more African American communities and working class Asian Americans. And so the bifurcation by community in the Silicon Valley happens by neighborhood, but it also happens by these incorporated suburbs. And Fremont has very much built itself up as a middle and even upper middle income suburb, in part because it's been able to attract many of those high valued Silicon Valley companies to the neighborhoods. Whereas some of the other working class suburbs are, the homes of, really lower skilled labor in the Silicon Valley. So it's the bifurcation by neighborhood and by city really reflects the larger bifurcation within Silicon Valley of skilled and unskilled labor. And so you see this happen across the landscape of cities, and where cities are attracting high-tech companies, they're also attracting high-skilled professionals to live and work near those places, and where they're attracting the manufacturing hubs for the parts and labor for many of those the component parts of that really is where you see more working class neighborhoods begin to emerge. And so Fremont is a very particular kind of suburb that's really catering to that professional immigrant class.
Thank you. So Dr. Chang asks about Asian malls. If you could talk a little bit about how investment and capital affect the development of the shopping malls. And in particular, he's wondering where the money comes from and if there are US investors and banks. And this also, I was also thinking along similar lines. In today's class, we were also reading Wei Li's work on ethnoburbs, and she talks a lot about transnational capital as one of the big sources of ethnoburbs. So did you find that in Fremont, or is that different in your case?
No, there is definitely some transnational capital, and even and many of the Asian mall developers have ties to banks in China or other parts of Asia, and that's a significant source of their capital. And there's also Asian American investor groups. There's also Asian American realtor groups that are sometimes involved in the development of these shopping malls. I'd say that's much less that's much more so on the developer side and not on the entrepreneur side of the retail owners that occupy these strip centers that are oftentimes cobbling together money from their families and friends in order to start their businesses as they lack capital, access to capital and credit from other sources, which is very common amongst immigrant communities. You'll also, by the way, also see the names of stores working transnationally. And so you'll see, restaurants naming themselves after popular restaurants in Asia. And so people recognize the same places. And many people, and part of this transnationalism is also that a lot of these professionals that work in Silicon Valley have started high-tech companies overseas. So they are regularly migrating across the Pacific. They are trans-Pacific commuters in a sense. And so that flow of capital is not just a sort of latent connection. These are active connections and actively replicating landscapes on both sides of the Pacific, because that's the kind of lifestyles that many of these residents actually lead.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Balance asks about kind of the distinction between suburban inequality and urban inequality. So we were talking a lot about suburbs, and in particular, mansions and malls, but a lot of these, I would say phenomena are similarly occurring, or they sound quite similar to what many of us hear about urban inequality. So what are the similarities and differences between these two locales?
Yeah, I think inequality manifests itself in many different forms across many different landscapes. And so I think it's always important to think about the ways in which inequality in place, in part because that's what I do. I think about inequality and I think about place, and how these two things intersect. And in part, it's just shaping our ideas about where inequality can happen and how it's produced. So, our ideas about suburbs are, if our ideas about suburbs are that that poor people don't live there, then the inequality is largely about gaining access to the suburbs. If our sense of the suburbs is that non-white people don't live there, then our sense is still about getting access to these privileged places, right? But that's not actually the reality of what's happening in suburbs. The majority, as I said at the beginning, of immigrants, racial minorities, and poor families now live in suburbs. And so the ways in which inequality is reproducing itself in suburbs is not just between city and suburb, it's among suburbs. So you have, as we were talking about when we were talking about the bifurcation of Asian American families and not other non-white groups, you have vast inequalities among suburbs. And so how are those being reproduced? Through sort of where is employment centers being located? Where, how is municipal and corporation being used to hoard resources amongst different municipalities? How are zoning tools and regulations being used to exclude low-income housing from one community, and another community has to then accept low-income housing because that they need to provide for their residents? And so you see increasing both segregation among suburbs, but also increasing inequality amongst suburbs as you've seen this more diverse suburban landscape emerge.
I have a question that that I've been thinking about, and because I'm not a planner, I'd really actually would like to hear from you because something I really don't know how to make sense of. So I'm thinking a lot about climate change nowadays, and based on what I observed myself and what I learned from your book is that middle-class Asian American geography and more broadly middle-class suburban life is very much defined by expansion and spread. I think in your book you show that a lot of Asian Americans are dedicated to keeping that trend, right? They want more space and they more spread. But these forms of urban planning are often energy inefficient, though like the story you told about Daniel is not always the case. And sometimes or oftentimes preclude low-income inclusion, as we've talked about. So what lessons can we learn from Asian American geography when thinking about climate conscious and equitable planning?
What a great and difficult question. I think, part of what is bothersome to me, and so I'm Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education. Smart growth research has told us for a long time that we shouldn't be sprawling out, that we should be doing infill, that we should be trying to protect farmland and control growth out to the suburbs. And I absolutely believe that. But it is also true that as these regulations have come to the fore, as suburbs have begun to open up, right? And so as more non-white residents have moved out to the suburbs, a lot of white suburbanites have moved back to cities. And so there's a bit of attention over growth controls when you're talking about who's growing. And there's also, so I don't at all question that we should be doing infill development. But I also know that infill development can cause gentrification, right? And so when you think about balancing, inequalities with environmental considerations, I think you have to look a little bit more holistically at the picture of what do we mean by sustainable development and what do we mean by equitable and inclusive communities. And I think a lot of our narratives are driven through the lens of the white middle class experience. And so I think if we take a different lens to that, we come up with different solutions. And so we come up with a different idea of what it means to build sustainably, just as like the McMansion is often held up as the epitome of what it means to sort of build out in this gross suburban sprawling way. But when you take a look at Daniel's home and why Daniel is building his home and what sustainable features Daniel is talking about in his home, he says the California lawn is not sustainable. Why do we need lawns that we need to water in California? Yeah, like we have to take that seriously as an argument and not just sort of play into the stereotypes that I think lead to restrictions that don't always get us where we need to be.
Thank you for that. It's very thoughtful. I guess I have one last question. I think about gender and family in relation to race and immigration quite a bit, and I think you talked about this a little bit in your book. But I would love to hear a little bit more about the respectability of families. So I was wondering, how did the perception of Asian American family structure affect the desirability of Asian Americans by whites in these neighborhoods? And particularly thinking about, the middle class heterosexual nuclear family. And you've talked about, kind of more diverse non-normative families before. So did that help in the white members, feeling like Asian Americans belonged, or was it more exclusive, especially when we think about multi-generational households? How did that affect the acceptance of Asian Americans?
So many great questions from you, Jay. I think that heteronormativity helped. I mean, like that picture that I have on the front of the book. I mean, what more happy suburban family could you imagine? And so I think that Asian Americans in part, play the role of the good suburbanite, right? Their families oftentimes match families that would be those acceptable neighbors to white middle class families that then don't make room for a lot of difference within Asian American family structures and so forth. And so, I think that in part plays into the acceptability of Asian American families, and it also makes it more difficult when Asian Americans don't fit those stereotypes, right? So I did not talk to a lot of single mothers or people who didn't fit those stereotypes in Fremont, because largely they weren't there. Amongst the families that I was talking to, I shouldn't say they weren't there, they weren't the families that I was talking to, and at the center of the controversies that I was having. But I think we need to ask why that is, right? And how, both the design of the spaces and the regulation of the spaces, but also the policing of suburban neighborhoods around these same ideas that you're talking about have, play into those politics. But I'll also say that I think that's in part like the question around suburban versus urban inequality. Like the ideas of respectability are very different between urban and suburban neighborhoods. And suburban neighborhoods, you're supposed to come with your two family, your two kids and your husband and your wife, and those ideas about sort of who belongs in those neighborhoods is very much gendered and heteronormative in many middle-class neighborhoods like that.
Thank you. And before we let you go, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your upcoming projects and where things are going, and just a sneak preview so we can expect more from you.
Yeah. So as I explained in your class, I've now been thinking about and working on a second book project for a while. And this book project does not really center Asian American communities. It really centers more Black and Latinx communities that have located to the suburbs in the last several decades around the Washington, D.C. area. And many of these neighborhoods, like many of their urban counterparts, have experienced vast disinvestment and underinvestment as non-white communities have moved in. A lot of white flight from suburb to suburb as these families have moved in and are now experiencing new trends in redevelopment and vast public policy shifts, private development shifts that are encouraging more middle income educated professionals to move back into these neighborhoods. And so I'm really writing a book about suburban gentrification and what it means to gentrify a suburb, because many of our notions about suburbs are that they can't gentrify, but also really centering the activists that are fighting on the ground for affordable housing, small business protections, to help residents stay in place, and talking about why that matters, not just so that suburban communities can stay in place, but also why it matters when we think about our capacity to organize around these issues in places. And in suburbs, we haven't built the institutional infrastructure that really supports many marginalized communities. We haven't built the tenants association, the small business associations. We don't have nonprofit advocates on the ground that can work in these communities. And it's really stunting the organizing and what is possible for these communities to remain in place. So I'm very centered on that project, and also on my new role as director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, which comes in part out of this work on suburban gentrification, and recognizing that in many suburbs, the primary displacement is not just residential, it's really small businesses. And we really don't give enough attention to small businesses in our gentrification discourse, and definitely in our anti-displacement policy. And so we're building a national network of leaders who care about these issues, and a whole toolkit of ideas about what communities can do to combat commercial displacement, including for immigrant and minority-owned businesses in particular. So Asian Americans are very much centered in that work as well.
Thank you so much. Your work sounds so fascinating. And I think, like you mentioned in our class, you come to this work doing comparative ethnic work, ethnic studies work, and that's really exciting to see. So I'm really happy and excited to continue to see your work progressing. So I think we are just about at 6 o'clock. So I want to let everyone enjoy their evening. So thank you everyone for joining for Dr. Willow Lung-Amam's talk today. And I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And please do come back for our future events with the Asian American Studies program in the next few weeks. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.